Om Tat Sat. Welcome to Gyan Bhakti. We are currently exploring the holy scripture Mysticism of Ramayana. Commentaries by my Guruji, Swami Jyotirmayanandaji Maharaj, narrated by myself, Swami Nikhilananda. So let's get started. We are currently on Sundarkand. Rama secures the help of the ocean god is today's episode. Eager to accomplish his mission in Lanka, Rama sought the advice of Sugriva and Vibhishana about the best way to cross the ocean. O Rama, said Vibhishana, you can dry up not only this ocean but thousands of oceans by your single arrow. Still, to preserve dharma, the law of righteousness, in this relative world, you should first approach the ocean god, with humility and see whether he offers his help in response to your prayers. O friend, Rama said, you have advised me very well. I will do as you have said, and if God is willing, this method will succeed. Then, despite Lakshmana's protests that the approach suggested by Vibhishana was too timid, Rama seated himself beside the ocean and began meditating upon the ocean god. For 3 days, Rama continued meditating upon the ocean god and praying, who turned a deaf ear to Rama's prayers and went on surging as if nothing was happening. Then Rama became incensed and said, O Lakshmana, bring my bow and arrow. With my fiery arrow I will dry up this ocean. It is vain to show humility before a dull wit. Thus saying, Rama positioned his arrow and stretched the bow, to the great delight of Lakshmana. Immediately the entire ocean began to boil forth. In response, the ocean god gave up his pride and appeared before Rama as a Brahman, holding a golden platter filled with an offering of the best of the jewels. O Rama, he said, by your force I can be dried up and your army can cross, but by doing so nothing much would be gained. Instead, let me give you advice which will promote your fame and glory. In your army, there are 2 monkeys, Nala and Nila, who are born architects. In their childhood, they were blessed by a sage who gave them the boon that any rock or mountain they touch, reciting your divine name Rama, will float on the ocean as if it were a leaf. So let rocks and big mountain peaks be brought before Nala and Nila, and by simply touching them, they can easily build a bridge across the ocean. Rama, standing there with his arrow tightly stretched in his bow, was pleased with that assistance given by the ocean god and no longer needed to discharge the arrow against him. However, since Rama's arrow could not be rendered void, he had to shoot it in some direction. The ocean god asked Rama to discharge the arrow towards the northern part of the ocean, which abounded with terrible demoniac creatures who were the very embodiment of wickedness. Rama did so, destroying all those demons in a moment, and then prepared to give the command that the great bridge be built according to the ocean god's instructions. Mystical meaning. In many religious scriptures, such as the Ramayana, there are stories in which an ocean must be crossed, and in some miraculous way that ocean gives passage to the spiritual seeker. Crossing the ocean implies setting up a relationship with the unconscious depths so that negative impressions or ashubha vasanas may be replaced by positive impressions or shubhavasanas. Like Rama, every aspirant must build a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious mind, so that the integrated energy of the mind and senses, which implies monkeys and bears, mind being the monkeys and senses, and bears being the senses, they may be directed to the destruction of ignorance, Ravana, and its demoniac forces. So mind and senses constantly agitate us like monkeys and bears. Sattva guna, Vibhishana, inspires him to practice austerity and meditation, while Lakshmana, purified willpower, urges the soul to discharge the arrow of reflection and inquiry. Placing the arrow of intuitive insight on the bow of his concentrated mind, the aspirant shoots to destroy the accumulated store of karmas from countless lives. The ocean-like gulf that existed between the conscious and the unconscious mind is easily bridged by the rocks of divine impressions. Divine impressions are Shubha Sanskaras, or your good actions you have done over time. They are gathered by the divinely inspired mind and senses, monkeys and bears. Further, those rocks are handled by Nala and Nila, the qualities of Abhyasa and Vairagya. Abhyasa being repeated effort, and Vairagya, dispassion, that lead to success in concentration, meditation, and samadhi. This triple aspected process of the mind, known as samyama in Raja Yoga, is the bridge that renders the unconscious mind accessible, and Rama and his forces soon station themselves in Lanka for a direct confrontation with ignorance and its demoniac forces. So you see, this whole Ramayana is the battle of a spiritual aspirant. That is the deeper meaning for us. Although he could easily have forced the ocean to give passage, Rama allowed that task to be accomplished by a dynamic blending of self-effort and grace. So when we put in our self-effort, divine grace certainly comes. Exercising their self-effort, the monkeys and bears gathered the necessary rocks to span the ocean. However, as they handled each rock with the joyful utterances of Rama's name, a miracle occurred. Every rock began to float rather than sink. Imagine. Similarly, each action one performs in life must be done with a stamp of divine name, with the invocation of divine grace. Then that action becomes a stepping stone to self-realization rather than a karmic impediment that causes one to sink in the world process. Self-effort should never be relinquished. Not a single stone should be left unturned in the process of handling one's situations and circumstances. At the same time, however, one must witness the miraculous powers of grace that renders the impossible possible. So with this we have concluded the Sundarkand, and now let us step into Lanka Kand. And the first episode is Building the Bridge. With great eagerness and enthusiasm, the monkeys and bears broke off rocky segments from mountains all over the world and brought them to Nala and Nila. Endowed with Rama's grace and their own special powers, these monkey architects then floated the rocks on the ocean waters and created a great bridge to the shores of Lanka. As soon as the bridge was ready, Lord Rama and all the monkeys and bears began to make their way across. As they passed by, numerous aquatic creatures pushed their heads up above the waves out of eagerness to behold Rama, and their bodies formed an additional bridge to carry the weapons and the warriors across. Seeing how the monkeys and bears were crossing the ocean by climbing on these aquatic creatures, Rama and Lakshmana smiled with amusement, and very soon they all reached the distant shore. Upon arriving in Lanka, Lord Rama and his extraordinary army set up camp on a peak in the Subela mountains on the outskirts of Ravana's capital. There they dined on the abundant sweet fruits around them and began to harass the demons that came to spy on them. So we will continue with this episode in tomorrow's satsang. This is Swami Nikhilananda. Om Tat Sat.